Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
It started with a sentence so casually dropped at the dining table that for a second I wasn't sure I had even heard it right. My mother, while adjusting the serving spoons around the mashed potatoes and fussing with the cranberry sauce, said almost offhandedly, "This year we're keeping Christmas more intimate, just the families with kids." The words slid out of her mouth like she was reading off a grocery list, yet the weight of them pressed down on me harder than any argument we had ever had. I looked around the table, trying to catch someone's eye, maybe hoping one of my siblings would step in, laugh nervously, and say Mom was joking. But no one did. Emily just smirked like she had been waiting for this announcement, her two kids climbing all over their chairs while she preened like she was the queen of fertility. Josh leaned back, sipping his beer with that half-shrug that said, "Don't drag me into this." I felt the sting crawl up my neck, and my first instinct was to laugh it off, to say something sarcastic like I usually did when my family tried to remind me that not having kids somehow made me incomplete. But the silence after her words was thick, suffocating, and I knew if I laughed now I'd choke on it. So I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table, and asked, "Are you serious?" My voice was steady, but there was something sharp in it, the kind of edge you get when you're one more comment away from snapping. Mom didn't even look up, just kept fiddling with the serving dish as if I were some background noise. "It's not personal, honey," she said, still with that maddeningly calm tone. "It's just, the kids make the holidays magical, you know? And we want to focus on that this year." I swear the whole room tilted. Focus on the kids. As if the rest of us, adults without children, were nothing but static around the real stars of the show. Emily reached over to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, clearly enjoying the moment, and muttered, "It makes sense, Rachel. It's about family, and you'll understand one day." My husband Mark, who had been silent until then, set down his fork slowly, the quiet clink of metal against porcelain sounding louder than anything else in the room. He glanced at me, his eyes steady, and said nothing because he knew me well enough to know I didn't need him to jump in. He just gave me that slight nod that meant, "I'm with you, whatever you do next." I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. All my life, my family had had this unspoken hierarchy where whoever produced children got promoted to some higher rank of belonging. They got the better gifts, the praise, the attention, the invitations to real family moments. And I was supposed to sit there, the childless one, the one with a career and vacations, but no real legacy, and smile politely while my chair was pushed further and further away from the center of the table. "Family is family," I said finally, and my voice cracked just a little, though I fought to keep it strong. "And I'm part of it, whether I've got kids or not." Josh coughed into his beer, not quite laughing but close, and Mom gave me this pitying glance like I was being difficult. Emily just stared straight at me, smug and unbothered, like she had already won something I hadn't even realized we were competing for. That was when Mark leaned in, his voice low enough that only I could hear it. "Don't beg," he said softly. "We don't need them to validate us. Let's make our own plan." And that was the switch. My anger burned hot, but his words poured a strange calm over me, not because I wanted to let it go, but because I realized there was a sharper, more satisfying way to answer this insult. If they thought I didn't belong, then maybe I'd stop trying to squeeze myself into their definition of family. Maybe I'd show them what it looked like when someone refused to be sidelined. I pushed my chair back with deliberate slowness, the scrape of wood against tile making everyone glance up at me. I picked up my wine glass, raised it just slightly, and let out a laugh that wasn't friendly at all. "You know what? Fine. If kids are the entry ticket to your holiday traditions, then I'll find somewhere that actually wants me." I took a sip, savoring the way Emily's smug expression faltered for a second. "Merry Christmas in advance, everybody. Enjoy your magical memories." I set the glass down harder than I meant to, the sound echoing through the room. Mom opened her mouth, probably to smooth it over, but I didn't wait for her words. I leaned toward Mark, still smiling, and whispered just loud enough for them to hear, "Fine. I'll spend my holidays where I'm wanted." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't mine to carry anymore. I stood, smoothed down my dress, and walked out of the room with Mark at my side. The last thing I heard before the door closed was Emily muttering under her breath, Drama queen. But if she thought that was the end of it, she had no idea what was coming next. Because the truth was, I wasn't walking away defeated, I was walking towards something else entirely. And by the time they realized it, it would already be too late. Back in the car, with the cold pressing against the windshield and the streetlights smearing into tired gold lines, I sat next to Mark and let the silence stretch until it felt less like defeat and more like a decision hardening into place. Because once the first humiliation cooled into something sharper, I realized that begging for a seat at a table that had already been cleared for me was the most ridiculous performance I had been staging for years, and I was finally done with it. Mark drove without filling the air with pep talks, which was his quiet way of respecting me, but when we pulled into our driveway, he reached across the console, squeezed my hand, and in that single pressure I heard everything I needed, including the invitation to choose something bold instead of something small. So I walked straight inside, slipped off my heels that had been killing me since the second glass of wine, opened my laptop at the kitchen counter, and typed 5-star winter resort. Last minute. With the kind of ruthless focus people usually reserve for legal filings or revenge diets. The options unfolded like a dare, each glossy photo promising warmth, privacy, and the kind of service that calls you by your name before you even give it. And while a petty voice in my head whispered that choosing a place with palm trees and private plunge pools was maybe a little on the nose, a larger, steadier voice said that nose or not I had been handed a label I never asked for, and tonight I could either wear it or replace it. So I filtered for adults-only wings, quiet beaches, and a breakfast policy that did not involve sticky hands or cartoon waffles, then paused, because I knew exactly what my family would say if they saw the plan. Must be nice, must be selfish, must be compensating. All those musts lined up like a choir that never stopped singing. Mark leaned against the counter and watched me scan photos of cabanas edged in white curtains that breathed with the breeze, and he said, with a smile so small I almost missed it, that we had enough miles to upgrade to the kind of suite where the towels felt like new promises, which meant the universe had already prepared a velvet rope for our escape, and I should take it. So I chose a resort that my sister had once named on a vision board that she never built into anything more than a Pinterest folder, because symbolism can be delicious when it is served chilled, and I booked a suite with a balcony that looked like an answer to a question I had not yet asked. While my confirmation email did its little parade across the screen, I packed in a slow, deliberate way that made the act of choosing swimsuits in December feel like a manifesto, tossing in sundresses that draped instead of clung, sandals that clicked softly, a crimson lipstick that I wore when I needed to remember I had a face that did not belong to anyone else's story, and a book I had been saving for a week when no one would interrupt me with practical questions about casserole timing or whether I had considered freezing my eggs, because sometimes revenge is not a speech, but a schedule that excludes other people's demands. We flew out before dawn, stepped into an airport that smelled like coffee and decisions, and when we landed in heat that kissed my shoulders like it had missed me, the resort car greeted us with cool towels and water in glass bottles that clinked, and the lobbies smelled faintly of citrus and eucalyptus, which felt like the opposite of the candle my mother burns that claims to smell like holiday cheer, but always smells like a headache with cinnamon. The suite door swung open to reveal floor-to-ceiling windows framing a slice of ocean so blue it could have been edited by a show-off, and in that moment I felt something loosen under my ribs, not forgiveness exactly, not even peace, but a kind of alignment that made my lungs expand all the way, as if withholding from myself had been a habit I could finally unlearn. At sunset the sky went the color of a bruise fading, and Mark ordered grilled fish that flaked under the fork, while I asked the server to bring me the kind of cocktail that looks harmless and tastes like vacation until it very gently tips your chin up and says, "Hush now, the work is over," and I felt the exact pettiness level I was comfortable with rise to the surface, because while I am not petty by default, I am absolutely capable of using the right words at the right time like a sharpening stone. So I opened my phone, framed a poolside photo where the water looked like liquid glass and the horizon drew a clean line between what was mine and what was theirs, and I wrote a caption that did not gloat yet did not apologize, a single sentence that said, "Spending the holidays where I am actually invited, followed by a simple heart for Mark in the frame, because he was the invitation. I hovered for a breath that felt like a held note, saw in my mind the group chat with its predictable exhale of judgments and wounded pride, and I pressed post, not because I needed their eyes, but because I wanted my own. And within seconds, the little dots of affirmation began to bloom, old friends from college and coworkers from years back, and a handful of people who always comment when I do something audacious, and then, just as the sky poured itself into night and the first lanterns flickered along the path to the beach, my phone vibrated with the first alert from the family thread, a preview of a message from Emily that started with the words, "Must be nice," while another notification stacked over it from Mom asking if I really thought broadcasting my choices during a sacred family week was kind or necessary, and a private text from Josh that just read, "You're lighting a match," which made me smile. Because of course I was, and because this time I had every intention of watching what burned. The notifications began as a trickle that looked innocent enough, a few hearts from old college friends who always cheer when I do something that looks like choosing myself. A playful comment from my coworker who said the water matched my dress and asked if I finally learned to order in Spanish without accidentally requesting a bathtub. And then the ripple widened into a current as Emily arrived under my post with a sentence so polished in its sweetness that you could cut your tongue on it, insisting that while she was glad I was resting, she really wished I would consider the example I was setting for the younger generation who learn what matters from what we show them online. Which translated neatly into the same old sermon that motherhood is the only diploma hanging on the wall of womanhood and everything else is a handmade certificate you print at home. I read it twice and felt the familiar heat rise, that blend of old hurt and new indignation that used to send me into the rabbit hole of over-explaining, but instead of firing back, I picked up my drink and let the ice bells ring against the glass, while Mark reached across the table and brushed his thumb across my wrist with an absent tenderness that felt like a handrail on a dark staircase. And I decided to answer the sermon not with an argument, but with a better invitation. I opened the story composer and typed slowly because intention deserves punctuation, and I wrote that this year I was donating a chunk of what I would have spent on gifts to a local foster youth fund recommended by the resort's community coordinator, and that for every meaningful comment, defined plainly as more than 3 words and less than a lecture, I would add $5, capped at a number that sounded generous, but still responsible because I pay my own bills and do not intend to become a martyr with a great credit score. And then I hit share, not to smirk but to set terms, because if we were going to talk about what holidays teach children, then I could participate without auditioning for sainthood or motherhood. And I could do it while wearing sunscreen and a swimsuit with straps strong enough to make me feel held. The responses pivoted sharply as strangers and friends chimed in with memories of holidays where they felt invisible, and people without children told me they felt seen, which was a strange kind of warmth, respectful and quiet, and in the middle of that softness came my mother's direct message, short and cold, asking whether I truly believed that charity erases the rudeness of flaunting a beach while my niece practiced the carol she wanted her aunt to hear on Christmas Eve. I stared at that line for a full minute because there was a time when it would have knocked the wind out of me, but grief and guilt age differently when you stop feeding them, so I took a breath, typed that I loved my niece, that she is welcome to call me any night she wants and I will listen to any song she sings, and that I am no longer asking for permission to exist happily when my happiness is not shaped like hers. Then I put the phone face down on the table and asked the server for another round because I wanted to pair coconut and lime with boundaries and see which tasted better, and Mark laughed in that quiet way he does when he approves of my defiance, but knows I will pay for it later in sleeplessness. Moments later, Josh messaged privately with a photo of his kid in footed pajamas, making a tower out of empty boxes, saying that the group chat had graduated from annoyed to furious, and warning me with the soft honesty he rarely lets out that Emily was telling everyone I staged the donation announcement to spin my trip into something noble, which was both predictable and somehow still insulting, so I thanked him, told him to put the tower engineer on the phone tomorrow because I wanted to hear about the structural choices, and then I returned to my own little campaign. I took a short video that framed the edge of the infinity pool where the water met the sky in a quiet handshake and panned to the table where the plates were arriving one by one like small performances. A citrus salad that tasted like sunshine remembered. A grilled fish with a ribbon of herb sauce, and then a ridiculous dessert that looked like a cloud had decided to take up pastry as a second career, and I captioned the clip with a sentence that winked but did not spit, saying that I was enjoying a holiday where the only tantrums were the waves, and while I know the line was petty, it was also satisfying because sometimes the point of a vacation is to practice living without the apology that rides shotgun in your skull. Within minutes, Emily replied under the video with a paragraph about class and taste, and how some people display money because they need to feel important, which was funny because the trip was mostly points and miles earned through years of boring groceries and responsible choices, and also because my sister's house looks like a catalog that became sentient and requested more beige. I typed 3 possible responses and deleted each, because it is a special kind of freedom to let someone reveal themselves without your help. Then I pinned a comment from a stranger who wrote that holidays are an ecosystem and the only species that should be endangered is contempt. When the first fireworks began to unzip the dark over the bay and the lanterns along the path blinked awake like a runway guiding us toward the night's second act, I set up the camera on the railing, slid into the frame with Mark, who kissed my temple as the plate of lobster arrived shining like a joke about excess that I refused to take personally, and I scheduled the video to publish in 10 minutes with a caption that read, "Dinner with the only tradition we never skip, choosing each other." Then, as the countdown began and the sky loosened into color, my phone vibrated with an incoming call from my mother marked urgent, which I let ring long enough to make a point before I pressed accept and hit speaker. Because if we were going to perform family tonight, I wanted an audience for the truth. The phone call came just as the sun had begun to surrender to night, painting the sky in streaks of indigo and molten orange that stretched like a promise across the horizon, and when I saw my mother's name flash across the screen, I felt the old familiar twinge of tension that always accompanied her attempts at control. Yet this time, instead of flinching, I pressed accept and let the line connect. Because I was no longer a guest in the theater of their expectations, and I had learned that listening first often gives you the clearest view of what to say next. Her voice, tight and polished with indignation, carried across the line with a precision that made it obvious she had rehearsed every syllable, telling me that I had humiliated the family with my social media posts, that my decision to flaunt my vacation in a resort that they could never imagine visiting had crossed lines that ought never to be crossed, and that the children were being taught that selfishness is a virtue, which struck me as ironic considering she had just spent the previous hour praising Emily for letting her kids pick all the decorations while ignoring my presence entirely, and I realized in that moment that the hypocrisy was the real holiday tradition. I let her words wash over me without interruption, knowing that to counter immediately would be to play their game, and I allowed the images of lantern-lit beaches, private dinners that smelled faintly of grilled citrus, and the soft hum of the ocean just outside my balcony to fill the space between us, because those were my witnesses, and they had no reason to be polite or to offer excuses for someone else's cruelty. When she finally paused to take a breath, I replied steadily, detailing the years in which I had silently accepted their hierarchy, the countless holidays in which I had smiled while being relegated to corners, and the evenings I had spent adjusting my own expectations so that their discomfort might feel less like rejection and more like care, and I emphasized that this vacation was not an attack, but an assertion of autonomy, a statement that my existence and joy did not require their approval, which seemed to make her sputter into a near silence, as if the very words contradicted the narrative she had told herself about my supposed ingratitude. Emily's voice soon joined the call, clipped and defensive, accusing me of turning generosity into a spectacle, of seeking attention at the expense of family dignity, and I countered not with anger but with facts, reminding her of the times she had curated perfection in the household while dismissing my presence as optional, pointing out that I had contributed to every holiday, every preparation, and every gesture without expectation of recognition, and that perhaps their outrage was less about My photos and more about facing the uncomfortable truth that I could exist fully, beautifully, and independently outside of the narrow framework they had constructed. Josh sent a text in real time, warning me that the conversation was escalating beyond what he could mediate, but I continued, calmly narrating the contrast between the sterile expectation of participation under duress and the living, breathing reality of choosing moments and people that matter, describing Mark's quiet support, the subtle perfection of the resort staff, the way the ocean seemed to stretch endlessly, unbound by arbitrary rules, and the way my own laughter had filled the evening for the first time in a long time without apology or explanation. My mother began to speak again, her tone sharper, warning me that they would reconsider holiday invitations in the future and that my actions could have lasting consequences for family cohesion, but I interrupted softly, asking whether cohesion required silence and compliance or whether it could also survive acknowledgement of difference, whether tradition demanded conformity or whether it could expand to include joy without judgment. And then I leaned back against the balcony railing, listening, as the waves whispered beneath, letting the horizon absorb my tension while Mark quietly held my hand, and in that simple gesture I understood that confrontation did not require capitulation. Finally, I ended the call with words that were measured yet impossible to misinterpret, saying that I loved them, that I had always valued our connection, and that the choices I made were about being present in my own life, not about defiance for its own sake. Leaving the line open for their reflection rather than my defense, and when I hung up, I did not feel victorious in the sense of gloating, but triumphant in the sense of being fully seen by someone who mattered the most, which is the quietest, most enduring kind of revenge. I turned back to the suite, watching the lanterns flicker along the path to the ocean as the stars appeared one by one, marking the sky with constellations that had no need for human judgment. And I realized that the satisfaction of this evening did not lie in social media validation or in their inevitable discomfort, but in the fact that I had carved a space for myself where I was not measured by what I lacked, where laughter and conversation were not restricted by expectation, and where every sip of wine, every bite of carefully prepared dinner, and every ripple of water under the moonlight belonged solely to the truth of my existence. In the quiet of the night, as the resort hummed softly with distant music and the surf, I understood that sometimes the most effective revenge is not dramatic or loud, but simple, undeniable, and utterly complete, leaving the other side to wrestle with their assumptions while you move forward into the space you claimed for yourself. The morning arrived slow and golden, as if the sun had taken its time to stretch across the horizon, washing the resort in a light that made every surface, every ripple in the pool, and every shadow cast by the palm fronds feel deliberate and unhurried. A perfect contrast to the storm of messages and calls that had begun flooding in overnight, and I watched them silently, sipping coffee that was far too strong for comfort, but exactly right for the clarity it provided, knowing that each alert, each ping from my phone, was a reminder of the ripple I had set in motion the moment I chose to exist fully outside of their narrow definitions of family, and yet I felt no panic, no need to defend myself. Only a quiet satisfaction in the knowledge that my presence had become an undeniable fact, visible and unavoidable, the same way the sun is visible regardless of whether anyone chooses to look at it. Mark sat beside me, reading the paper and glancing up now and then with a faint smile that spoke of shared secrets, and I realized that he understood the magnitude of what we had created together, a narrative that could not be ignored. A statement that our happiness was self-determined, and a quiet but powerful rebuttal to the long-standing judgment that had sought to measure my worth by someone else's parameters. And as I scrolled through the family group chat, seeing Emily's messages morph from passive-aggressive jabs to increasingly frantic attempts to assert authority and moral high ground, I understood that this was not just about holiday resentment, but about the collision of expectations with reality, and the uncomfortable truth that some forms of influence cannot be contained simply by labels or guilt. By late morning, the resort staff had delivered breakfast to the balcony, and as I poured syrup over the waffles that came in shapes far too perfect to be accidental, I drafted another social media post with careful consideration. describing the quiet generosity of the resort in supporting local communities and highlighting a charity drive for children in need that we had quietly contributed to, ensuring that the post conveyed kindness without apology, accomplishment without boast, and above all, autonomy without negotiation. And when I hit publish, I watched the likes, shares, and comments accumulate in real time, knowing full well that the family would read every word and interpret it through the lens of their own expectations, which made the act of sharing simultaneously a celebration and a revelation, a mirror held up to those who had long defined me by absence rather than presence. Around midday, a call came from my mother, her voice sharp and edged with frustration, yet beneath the irritation I detected a tremor, a hesitation. Perhaps a glimpse of recognition that her carefully constructed narrative about my supposed inadequacies was being challenged not with confrontation, but with simple, undeniable evidence of choice, confidence, and consequence. And I allowed her to speak while sipping coffee, letting her frustration carry itself into the quiet of the suite while I framed each moment in my mind as a silent witness to the culmination of years in which I had endured exclusion, only to arrive at this point unbound, unapologetic, and entirely visible. Emily attempted a more direct approach, calling repeatedly, leaving messages pleading for explanation, for acknowledgement, for some concession that I would never make, and I observed her efforts as if from a distance, noting the irony in her insistence on propriety and the very public means she had chosen to convey private indignation, and when I finally responded, it was with calm, deliberate words that acknowledged the importance of family while asserting that my happiness and presence were no longer subject to their judgment, reminding her and my mother that the most profound influence is often the one that cannot be dictated or restrained, and that choices made with intention have consequences that extend far beyond immediate discomfort or disapproval. By evening, the resort transformed into a quiet sanctuary of light and sound, with lanterns floating over the pool and the ocean reflecting the moon in a vast, unbroken mirror, and I stood at the balcony with Mark, looking out at the horizon and feeling the depth of a freedom I had earned through patience, strategy, and the courage to refuse to conform to expectations that had never been mine. And as the last notifications flickered across my phone, each one a testament to the collision between desire, judgment, and autonomy, I realized that the final act of this holiday was not a confrontation, nor a triumph declared in words or gestures, but the simple, undeniable truth that I had chosen where I belonged, that my existence had been celebrated in the most profound way, and that those who sought to measure me would now have to contend with a reality they had not created, a reality defined by agency, joy, and the quiet, unassailable assertion of self that requires no audience, no permission, and no apology. And as the night deepened and the distant hum of the ocean joined the soft whispers of the wind through the palms, I let the final thought settle into place, understanding that the last word was no longer mine to speak, for it had already been written in the laughter, in the light, and in the irrefutable presence of a life claimed on my own terms, leaving behind only the echo of questions and reflections for those who had once sought to contain me, and in that echo, I found a satisfaction that was as complete as it was silent, leaving the story unresolved yet profoundly concluded in the most essential way.